The clinking of baccarat crystal ceased. 14 of Wall Street's most ruthless predators sat frozen, staring at the woman holding a silver tray of empty martini glasses. She wasn't a senior analyst. She wasn't a managing partner. She wore the starched white apron and black vest of a Wellington Club waitstaff. The silence in the private dining room was suffocating, heavy with the scent of roasted wagyu, expensive cologne, and suddenly ruined egos. Alistair Covington, a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small island nations, slowly lowered his Mont Blanc pen. "What did you just say?" he whispered, his voice dangerously low. Audrey didn't flinch. "I said, your mezzanine debt amortization schedule is off by $300 million. The Wellington Club on East 64th Street in Manhattan was not a place where people went to be seen. It was a place where people went to ensure their secrets remained unseen. Membership was not a matter of wealth, but of lineage, leverage, and absolute discretion. The dining room walls were paneled in dark, centuries-old mahogany, and the floors were covered in Persian rugs, so thick they swallowed the sound of footsteps completely. Audrey Hayes knew those rugs intimately. She spent 60 hours a week walking across them, carrying trays of beluga caviar and 100-year-old cognac. At 28, Audrey possessed a mind that had once been the subject of hushed, reverent whispers in the mathematics department at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Her doctoral thesis on stochastic calculus and predictive market volatility had been fast-tracked for publication. She had been recruited by Bridgewater, by Citadel, by quant funds that promised signing bonuses large enough to buy a house in cash. But life, unlike mathematics, rarely follows a predictable formula. 3 years ago, her father, Thomas, was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's, complicated by a rare neurological decay. The medical bills evaporated his modest savings in a matter of months. Then, his pension fund collapsed, due to a corporate restructuring that left the retirees with pennies on the dollar. Audrey had no choice. She took a leave of absence from MIT, moved back to New York to care for him, and quickly realized that entry-level quant hours, 80-hour weeks locked in a cubicle, would not allow her to physically care for her father. The Wellington Club, however, offered a bizarre salvation. The tips from men who regularly closed billion-dollar deals over lunch were astronomical. She could work 4 shifts a week, earn more than a first-year analyst, and still be home to administer Thomas's medications and help him navigate his fading world. To survive at the Wellington, Audrey had to master the art of invisibility. "You are the furniture," Gregory, the maitre d', had instructed her on her first day. Gregory was a severe man of French descent, who ran the dining room with the precision of a military campaign. "You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not make eye contact during a negotiation. You do not breathe too loudly. If a guest drops a fork, it is replaced before it hits the carpet. You are a ghost who pours excellent wine." Audrey excelled at being a ghost. She tied her dark hair into a severe, invisible bun. She learned to read the micro-expressions of billionaires, anticipating a desire for sparkling water or a fresh napkin before they even realized they wanted it. But more importantly, she listened. She couldn't help it. Her brain was a hyperactive engine, and as she stood silently in the corners of private dining rooms, she absorbed the terms of hostile takeovers, the structuring of shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and the algorithmic trading strategies of hedge fund titans. She did the math in her head, often spotting the flaws in their logic before the dessert course was served. She never said a word. It wasn't her world anymore, until the evening of November 12th. Room 4, the club's most secure private dining suite, had been booked under the name of Covington Capital Partners. Alistair Covington was a legend in private equity, a man known equally for his flawless tailored suits and his absolute lack of a moral compass. He specialized in distressed assets, buying dying companies, stripping them of anything valuable, raiding their pension funds, and leaving the hollowed-out carcass to file for bankruptcy. Tonight, Covington was hunting. Audrey stood at her station near the mahogany sideboard, carefully polishing a silver wine key. The room was set for 10 people. At the center of the table sat a massive floral arrangement of white orchids, flanked by crystal decanters of Chateau Margaux. "Tonight is critical, Audrey," Gregory hissed, materializing beside her, adjusting his cuffs. "Covington is hosting Dominic Gallagher, Meridian Freight. Do you understand what this means?" Audrey nodded once. Meridian is the largest independent logistics company on the eastern seaboard. Gallagher has been fighting off a hostile takeover for 6 months. Gregory blinked, momentarily taken aback by her precise knowledge, before regaining his composure. "Exactly. This is the surrender dinner. Covington is going to buy him out. There will be lawyers, accountants, and highly volatile tempers. I want flawless service. If Covington's glass is empty for more than 3 seconds, I will personally throw you out onto 64th Street. "Understood," Audrey said softly, her face a mask of professional indifference. But internally her stomach tightened. She knew of Dominic Gallagher. He was one of the last old-school industrialists, a man who had built Meridian from a single truck into an empire and who treated his employees like family. Her father had once driven a truck for a subsidiary of Meridian back when times were good. Gallagher's pension plan was the exact opposite of the one that had ruined her father. It was robust, protective, and sacred. If Alistair Covington got his hands on Meridian Freight, the first thing he would do was liquidate that pension fund to pay down the debt he used to buy the company. Thousands of families would face the exact nightmare Audrey was living right now. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the predators walked in. Alistair Covington entered the room like he already owned it. He was a striking man in his late 50s, with silver hair swept back from a sharp, predatory face, and eyes the color of winter ice. He moved with a relaxed, languid grace, flanked by his legal team and his chief financial officer, a perpetually sweating, intense man named Silas Croft. Dominic Gallagher arrived a moment later. The contrast was stark. Gallagher looked exhausted. His suit, though expensive, hung slightly loose on his frame, as if the stress of the last 6 months had physically consumed him. He brought only 2 advisors with him, an older lawyer and a young, exhausted-looking accountant. "Dominic, my friend," Covington said, extending a hand with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Thank you for agreeing to sit down. I know this hasn't been an easy process." "Let's skip the pleasantries, Alistair," Gallagher replied, his voice gruff, ignoring the outstretched hand. "I'm here because my board is terrified of your proxy war. Let's see the term sheet." "In due time," Covington purred, taking his seat at the head of the table. "First we eat, we drink, we remember that we are civilized men." Audrey moved into action. She flowed around the table, pouring water, serving the first course of seared diver scallops with a truffle puree. She was a phantom, entirely unnoticed by the men who were busy sharpening their knives for a different kind of meal. For the first hour, the conversation was a tense dance. Covington spoke of synergies, of modernizing Meridian's fleet, of unlocking shareholder value. Gallagher pushed back, fiercely defending his workers, demanding guarantees that the union contracts would be honored, and most importantly, that the pension fund would remain untouched. Audrey stood in the shadow of a heavy velvet drape, holding a bottle of the Margaux. Her eyes casually drifted to the large flat-screen monitor that Silas Croft, the CFO, had connected to his laptop at the end of the table. The screen displayed a complex financial model, the proposed architecture of the buyout. It was a leveraged buyout, LBO, standard operating procedure for Covington Capital. They would use Meridian's own assets as collateral to borrow the money to buy the company. But it was the structure of the contingent value rights, CVR, and the mezzanine debt that caught Audrey's attention. Croft stood up, clearing his throat, tapping a laser pointer against the screen. Dominic, to bridge the gap in our valuation, we are offering a stock-for-stock exchange, supplemented by a robust CVR. If Meridian hits its revenue targets over the next 36 months, your shareholders will receive an additional payout of $400 million. Furthermore, we are locking the pension fund in a trust, secured against the mezzanine debt tranche. Gallagher narrowed his eyes, leaning forward to study the spreadsheet projected on the screen. You're securing the pension against the mezzanine debt? That debt is subordinate. If the company hits a rough patch, that debt gets wiped out before the senior lenders take a hit. But look at the volatility modeling, Dominic, Covington interrupted smoothly, gesturing to a specific cell block on the screen. We've run 10,000 Monte Carlo simulations. The probability of the revenue dropping to a level that threatens the mezzanine tranche is less than 0.2%. The pension is functionally guaranteed. We are absorbing all the downside risk. Audrey's eyes tracked the numbers. She looked at the formula displayed in the formula bar at the top of the Excel sheet. It was a modified Black-Scholes options pricing model, used to calculate the probability of default. Her mind instantly began parsing the variables. S, the spot price. K, the strike price. R, the risk-free interest rate. Sigma, the volatility of the underlying asset. Wait. Audrey squinted, shifting slightly out of the shadows. The formula was massive, spanning 3 lines of text, nesting multiple if/then statements and logarithmic calculations. But to Audrey, mathematics was like reading sheet music. You could instantly hear when a note was out of tune. There was a dissonant chord in cell M14. Croft was calculating the volatility, sigma, based on trailing 12-month data. But in the nesting of the compounding interest formula for the mezzanine debt, he had misplaced a parenthesis. Instead of calculating 1 plus r over n to the power of n, say t, he had written the formula as 1 plus r over nn to the power of n and t. Furthermore, the standard deviation variable for the logistics market was inverted. Audrey did the mental arithmetic, running the projection forward 3 years. The Monte Carlo simulation wasn't showing a 0.2% chance of default. Because of the inverted volatility and the broken compounding formula, the model was artificially suppressing the risk curve. It was a massive, catastrophic error. If Meridian's revenue dropped by even a conservative 3%, a standard fluctuation in the shipping industry due to fuel prices, the mezzanine debt wouldn't just be threatened, it would implode. The covenants would trigger instantly. Covington Capital would be legally allowed to dissolve the pension trust to satisfy the senior creditors. It wasn't a guarantee. It was a mathematically disguised guillotine. Audrey looked at Croft. Was he incompetent, or was this intentional? Croft was sweating heavily, wiping his forehead with a linen napkin. His eyes darted nervously. It wasn't intentional. The man was simply out of his depth. He had built a Frankenstein model, copy-pasting complex quantitative formulas he didn't fully understand to appease his boss's demands. And Covington, for all his ruthless brilliance in negotiation, was not a quant. He trusted his CFO. He truly believed he had built a watertight trap that Gallagher couldn't refuse. "I don't like it," Gallagher muttered, staring at the screen. "It feels too clean." "It's clean because the math is absolute, Dominic," Covington said, his voice taking on a hard, final edge. The board has already seen this model. They are ready to accept it. If you fight this, you will be ousted, and I will buy the company anyway. But without these protections for your people, this is the best deal you will ever get. Sign the term sheet." Gallagher's young accountant frantically clicked through his own laptop, trying to verify the massive spreadsheet. But it was clear he was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of nested data. "Sir," the young man whispered to Gallagher, "the simulations seem to hold up. The variance it's minimal." Gallagher closed his eyes. The fight seemed to physically leave his body. He thought of his thousands of employees. He thought of his legacy. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy fountain pen. Audrey stood frozen by the sideboard, the cold glass of the Margot bottle pressing into her palm. "You are a ghost. You do not speak." Gregory's voice echoed in her mind. If she spoke, she would be fired immediately. The Wellington Club had a zero-tolerance policy for staff interacting with guests. She would lose the income that was keeping her father in a clean facility with specialized nurses. She would be blacklisted from every high-end service job in Manhattan. But as Gallagher unscrewed the cap of his pen, Audrey saw her father's face. She remembered the day he opened the letter from his own pension fund, the look of absolute, hollow devastation in his eyes when he realized 40 years of hard labor had vanished into the pockets of men exactly like Alistair Covington. The room was silent, save for the scratching of Gallagher's pen as he prepared to sign his name and the lives of thousands of workers away. "Before you sign that, Mr. Gallagher, you should know that the volatility smile in cell M14 is inverted, and the compounding schedule will trigger a technical default within 14 months. The words cut through the heavy, silent air of room 4 like a gunshot. For 2 full seconds nobody moved. The only sound was the low hum of the climate control system. Dominic Gallagher stopped, his pen hovering a millimeter above the signature line of the term sheet. Alistair Covington blinked, a look of profound, uncomprehending shock registering on his patrician features. 14 heads slowly turned, every eye in the room locked onto the waitstaff standing near the sideboard. Audrey stood perfectly still. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. But her outward demeanor remained completely composed. She held the bottle of Margot with a steady hand, her face impassive. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Covington whispered, the shock rapidly metastasizing into cold fury. Silas Croft, the CFO, shot out of his chair, his face flushed crimson. "Security! Get her out of here! How dare you speak!" "Quiet, Silas," Gallagher said suddenly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a man used to commanding thousands of truckers. He turned his tired eyes fully onto Audrey. "Who are you?" "My name is Audrey. I am your server for the evening," she replied evenly. "Would you care for more wine, sir?" "I don't give a damn about the wine," Gallagher rumbled. "What did you just say about the debt schedule?" "This is outrageous!" Covington slammed his hand flat on the mahogany table, the silverware rattling sharply. He glared at Audrey, his eyes venomous. "You are a waitress. Leave this room immediately before I have you arrested for corporate espionage." "If she's a corporate spy, she's doing a terrible job of hiding," Gallagher noted dryly. He looked back at Audrey. "You mentioned cell M14. "Dominic, you cannot seriously be listening to the help," Covington sneered, losing his polished veneer. "She's probably disgruntled, trying to cause a scene to extort a tip." "Let her speak," Gallagher demanded. He looked at his own young accountant, who was frantically scrolling through the spreadsheet. "Did you hear what she said? Check the cell." I'm looking, Mr. Gallagher," the young accountant stammered, sweat beading on his upper lip. The formula is incredibly dense. It's a custom macro. Audrey took a slow breath. The bridge was burned. There was no going back to being a ghost. She stepped away from the sideboard, placing the expensive wine on a side table, and walked gracefully toward the main table. She stopped a respectful distance from Covington, but looked directly at Croft. "Mr. Croft," Audrey said, her voice clear and carrying the authoritative cadence she used to use when presenting proofs in her MIT seminars. "In your calculation for the probability of the revenue floor dropping below the debt covenant threshold, you employed a modified Merton model, correct?" Croft stared at her, as if she had just sprouted a second head. Yes. How do you— And to calculate the asset volatility, you nested a historical standard deviation equation within the compounding interest formula for the mezzanine debt." Audrey didn't wait for an answer. She turned her gaze to the large monitor. "Look at the formula bar for M14. You wrote open parenthesis, 1 plus r close parenthesis over open parenthesis n to the power of nt close parenthesis. You missed the parenthesis. It should be open parenthesis 1 plus r over n close parenthesis to the power of na tau. By dividing by the exponent, instead of raising the parenthetical to the power of the term, you haven't calculated compound interest. You've calculated exponential decay." The room was deathly quiet. Even the lawyers had stopped breathing. Audrey continued, her mathematical mind fully engaged, the numbers flowing from her lips with devastating precision. Because of that typo, the simulation assumes the debt burden shrinks exponentially over time rather than growing. It artificially inflates the safety of the pension trust. Furthermore, your volatility index is inverted. You're subtracting the standard deviation from the mean rather than adding the variance. It flattens the curve. She turned back to Gallagher, meeting the older man's stunned gaze. "Mr. Gallagher, the Monte Carlo simulation on that screen shows a 0.2% chance of default. It is a mathematical illusion caused by a syntax error. If you correct the formula to standard financial modeling protocols, the true probability of default, assuming a conservative 3% market contraction, is not 0.2%. Audrey paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. It is 74%. Gallagher's face drained of color. 74. "Yes, sir," Audrey said softly. "Within 14 months, the covenants will trigger. Covington Capital will legally seize the pension trust to pay off the senior creditors. Your workers will be left with nothing. The entire structure is short by roughly $300 million. "She's lying! She's making it up! It's gibberish!" Croft shouted, spittle flying from his lips. He lunged toward his laptop, trying to close the screen. "Leave it open, Silas!" Covington barked, his voice cracking like a whip. He turned to his CFO, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. "Is she right? Did you miswrite the formula?" "Alistair, it's a massive model. It's millions of cells. Croft was trembling violently, his hands hovering over the keyboard. "She's a waitress. What does she know about stochastic modeling?" Covington slowly stood up. He smoothed the front of his Brioni jacket, walking around the table until he was standing just inches from Audrey. He towered over her, radiating hostility and power. "Who sent you?" Covington demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Did Apollo Management put you up to this? Did Goldman? How much are they paying you to sabotage this deal?" "Nobody sent me, Mr. Covington," Audrey replied, refusing to break eye contact. She could smell the peppermint on his breath, mixed with the metallic tang of adrenaline. "I am just a waitress who happens to know how to read a binomial options pricing model." "Prove it," Covington hissed. He stepped aside, gesturing aggressively toward the open laptop at the end of the table. "You think you're so smart? Prove he made a mistake. Touch that keyboard, and if you are wrong by even a fraction of a cent, I swear to God I will bury you in so much litigation you'll be paying my legal fees until the day you die." "Mr. Covington, that's entirely unnecessary," one of his lawyers started to say, half rising from his chair. "Shut up," Covington roared. He pointed at Audrey. "Show me the $300 million. Now." Audrey looked at the laptop. Then she looked at Gallagher, who gave her a slow, encouraging nod. She walked to the head of the table. She didn't sit down in Croft's vacated chair. She simply leaned over the keyboard. Her fingers, usually calloused from carrying heavy silver trays, hovered over the keys for a split second before descending in a blur of motion. Audrey's hands hovered over the silver alloy chassis of Silas Croft's laptop. The machine was warm to the touch, its cooling fans whirring softly under the strain of millions of active cells. To the 14 men in the room, the spreadsheet was a dense, impenetrable forest of data. To Audrey, it was a beautifully flawed piece of architecture, and she knew exactly which load-bearing pillar to kick. "Move," she commanded softly. Croft, paralyzed by a mixture of outrage and terror, stumbled backward, his chair scraping loudly against the Persian rug. Audrey didn't sit. She leaned over the keyboard, her posture rigid, her eyes locked on the screen. She pressed Ctrl+tilde to reveal the formulas across the active sheet. The screen transformed from a neat array of dollar signs and percentages into a sprawling, chaotic web of mathematical logic. "What is she doing?" hissed one of Covington's lawyers, loosening his silk tie. "She's pulling the source code of the macros," Gallagher's young accountant whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and absolute awe. "She's bypassing the front-end dashboard." Audrey's fingers flew across the keys. The rhythmic clacking filled the dead silence of the room. She navigated through 3 tabs of historical volatility data, isolating the array Croft had built to project Meridian Freight's localized shipping routes. "Here," Audrey said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "Cell block M14 through M400, the mezzanine tranche amortization." She highlighted the entire column. In the formula bar at the top of the screen, the flawed equation glared back at her. It was a grotesque mutation of standard financial modeling. "You see this?" she asked, pointing at the screen, though she was addressing the room at large. The standard formula for compound interest in a continuous yield model should be 1 plus R over N to the power of NAT. You are dividing your interest rate by the number of compounding periods and raising the sum to the power of periods multiplied by years. She deleted Croft's error with a quick tap of the backspace key. By writing 1 plus R over N to the power of NT, mister, Croft essentially instructed the model to divide the principal by an exponentially growing denominator. The model thinks the debt is evaporating. It is, mathematically speaking, a fantasy. With a few rapid keystrokes, Audrey re-entered the correct formula. She then moved to the volatility index. "And here," she continued, her tone entirely clinical, stripping the emotion from the room and replacing it with pure, brutal logic. "The implied volatility, sigma. You have it inverted against the risk-free rate, R. You subtracted the variance. I am correcting it to a standard log-normal distribution." Alistair Covington stood at the edge of the table, his face a mask of stone. A single bead of sweat traced a path down his left temple. He was a man who relied on leverage, on fear, and on the absolute certainty that he was the smartest person in any room. Watching a waitress in a starched apron dismantle his flagship acquisition strategy in less than 60 seconds was inducing a feeling he hadn't experienced in 30 years. Vertigo. "I'm executing the recalculation," Audrey announced. She pressed F9. At the bottom right corner of the Excel window, a small percentage bar appeared, calculating 10%, 35%. For 5 agonizing seconds, the room held its collective breath. Gallagher gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Croft looked as though he might physically be sick onto the carpet. Calculating 80%, 100%. The screen flashed. The dashboard on the large flat-screen monitor instantly updated. The sleek, calming green lines of the Monte Carlo simulation, which just moments ago depicted a gentle, profitable upward slope, violently snapped downward. It formed a jagged, aggressive red cliff that plummeted below the baseline. The number in the top right corner, the probability of default within 36 months, which had proudly displayed 0.2%, flickered and changed to 74.3%. And in the center of the screen, the Contingent Value Rights Trust, the sacred lockbox meant to protect the pensions of thousands of Meridian freight workers, displayed its projected deficit, minus $312,450,000. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of noise, it was the sound of a billion-dollar deal dying instantly. $312 million, Gallagher read aloud, his voice a low, dangerous gravel. He didn't look at the screen anymore. He slowly turned his head to look directly at Alistair Covington. "A clerical error," Croft choked out, his voice cracking. He lunged forward, trying to get between Covington and the screen. "Alistair, I swear it was a macro glitch. When we imported the data from the Bloomberg terminal, the syntax must have corrupted. I didn't—" "Shut up, Silas," Covington said softly. He didn't yell. The terrifying calm in his voice was far worse than his earlier shouting. He stared at the red numbers on the screen as if they were written in his own blood. "Is it true?" Gallagher asked, rising to his full height. The exhaustion that had plagued him for the last hour had vanished, replaced by the righteous fury of an old-school street fighter who realized his opponent had brought a razor blade to a boxing match. "Did you know, Alistair? Did you intentionally build a trap door into the pension trust?" "Dominic, be reasonable." Covington pivoted smoothly, though his eyes darted rapidly as his brain scrambled to salvage the narrative. "I employed dozens of analysts. Croft made a mistake, a regrettable one. But the core of the deal remains sound. We can easily restructure the mezzanine debt to cover the variance." "Variance?" Gallagher laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the mahogany panels. "You call $300 million a variance? That's the life savings of 4,000 truck drivers, Alistair. You are going to let me sign away their futures, trigger the covenants, and strip this company for parts. You are overreacting to a spreadsheet error pointed out by a—" Covington cast a venomous glance at Audrey. "A hospitality worker." "That hospitality worker," a new voice cut in, cold and sharp, "just saved me from a federal indictment." Everyone turned toward the far end of the table. Richard Sterling, the senior partner representing the sovereign wealth fund that provided 60% of Covington Capital's liquidity, slowly stood up. He was an older man, quiet throughout the entire dinner, nursing a glass of sparkling water. Now, his eyes were locked on Covington, with absolute disgust. "Richard," Covington started, raising a hand placatingly. "Let's not overcomplicate this. It's an internal auditing failure. Silas will be terminated tonight." "Don't patronize me, Alistair," Sterling snapped, his voice ringing with aristocratic authority. He tossed his linen napkin onto the table, like a judge throwing down a gavel. "My limited partners do not invest in internal auditing failures to the tune of $350 million. If Gallagher had signed that term sheet, and the unions discovered that pension trap, the SIC would have crawled so far up our operations they'd be auditing our lunch receipts. You exposed us to catastrophic liability." "I am managing the risk," Covington flared, his polished facade finally cracking. "That's what you pay me for." "No, I pay you to win without leaving fingerprints," Sterling countered ruthlessly. He looked past Covington, his gaze falling on the young woman still standing by the laptop. "What did you say your name was, miss?" Audrey took a half-step back, suddenly feeling the intense, collective weight of the room's attention shifting back to her. The adrenaline rush of the mathematics was fading, replaced by the stark reality of her situation. She was a waitress. She had broken every rule of the Wellington Club. "Audrey," she said quietly. "Audrey Hayes." "Miss Hayes," Sterling said, nodding respectfully. "Where did you learn to pass a Merton model on sight?" "MIT," Audrey answered simply. "I was a doctoral candidate in applied mathematics." Gallagher let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "MIT, and you're pouring wine for these vultures. The world is broken." He looked back at Covington, his expression hardening into granite. "The deal is dead, Alistair," Gallagher stated with absolute finality. "There is no restructure. There is no revised term sheet. I am taking Meridian Freight off the table." "You can't do that," Covington sneered, recovering a fraction of his bravado. "You don't have the capital to fight off my proxy vote. I already control 12% of your voting shares. I will bleed you out in the boardroom, Dominic. It will just take longer, and it will be much, much uglier." Gallagher smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. "You're right, Alistair. You do own 12% of my company. But after tonight, I don't think you're going to want it." Gallagher reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't dial a number, just tapped it thoughtfully against his chin. "What are you talking about?" Covington demanded. "I'm talking about the fact that Miss Hayes just proved your flagship quantitative modeling is entirely fraudulent," Gallagher said, his voice carrying the weight of a death sentence. "And Richard here just admitted that your sovereign wealth backers are terrified of SEC exposure." Gallagher leaned over the table, his face inches from Covington's. "If word gets out to Wall Street tomorrow morning that Covington Capital's internal models are rigged, that you're accidentally calculating exponential decay instead of compound interest, what happens to your stock price, Alistair? What happens to the 3 other LBOs you have pending this quarter when those targets demand to audit your math?" Covington froze. The color completely drained from his face. He looked at Croft, who was staring at his shoes, entirely broken. He looked at Sterling, who was already reaching for his overcoat, abandoning him. Gallagher had him. It was a perfect, inescapable checkmate. "Here is my counteroffer," Gallagher said softly, sliding the unsigned term sheet back across the table. "Meridian Freight will buy back your 12% stake. Tonight. But we aren't paying a premium. We are paying a 30% discount on yesterday's closing price." "That's extortion," Covington breathed, his eyes wide. "That's a $50 million loss for my fund." "It's a stupidity tax," Gallagher corrected him. "You sign over your shares, and I don't leak the fact that a waitress just publicly dismantled your chief financial officer in under 2 minutes. You keep your reputation, I keep my company, and my truckers keep their pensions." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of room 4 burst open. Gregory, the maitre d', stood in the doorway, his face purple with outrage. He took in the scene, the furious billionaires, the glowing red screen of the laptop, and Audrey, standing firmly in the center of the chaos, far away from her assigned station. "Audrey!" Gregory practically shrieked, abandoning all pretense of Wellington Club decorum. "What in God's name are you doing? Get out of here immediately! You are terminated! Clean out your locker and leave this building!" Before Audrey could even process the words, Before she could feel the crushing weight of losing her job and the lifeline for her father's medical care, Dominic Gallagher turned toward the doorway. "Hold on a minute, Gregory," Gallagher barked, his voice silencing the maitre d' instantly. Gallagher looked at Audrey. He saw the sudden panic flare in her eyes, the stark reality of her situation crashing down on her. He looked at her starched apron, then at the massive, complex mathematical ruin she had just exposed on the screen. "She doesn't work for you anymore, Gregory," Gallagher said, turning his gaze back to Covington, holding out his fountain pen. "Sign the paper, Alistair, because Miss Hayes and I have a great deal to discuss." The scratch of Alistair Covington's Mont Blanc pen against the heavy stock paper sounded like the tearing of a bedsheet in a quiet house. It was a violent, final noise. He didn't read the revised addendum that Gallagher's older lawyer hastily drafted on the back of a pristine menu card. Covington simply signed his name, a jagged, angry scrawl that surrendered 12% of Meridian Freight back to its founder at a 30% loss. $50 million of institutional wealth evaporated in the span of 3 minutes, all because of a missing parenthesis and a waitress who refused to remain invisible. Covington threw the pen onto the table. It clattered against a crystal water goblet. He didn't look at Gallagher. He didn't look at Silas Croft, who was still weeping silently into his hands. Most tellingly, he did not look at Audrey. "You have made a very powerful enemy tonight, Dominic," Covington whispered, his voice stripped of its usual theatrical resonance. It was the hollow sound of a beaten man trying to salvage a shred of dignity. "I've survived worse things than you, Alistair," Gallagher replied, folding the menu card and sliding it into his breast pocket. "Don't let the mahogany doors hit you on the way out." Covington stood, buttoned his bespoke jacket with trembling fingers, and walked out of room 4. His legal team scrambled like frightened mice to gather their briefcases and follow him. Richard Sterling, the sovereign wealth representative, simply gave Gallagher a curt nod of respect and departed in the opposite direction, clearly intending to sever all ties with Covington Capital before the sun rose. Gregory, the maitre d', remained frozen in the doorway, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. The reality of what had just transpired, a hostile corporate takeover dismantled in his dining room by his newest hire, was entirely incompatible with his worldview. "Mr. Gallagher, I must apologize profoundly for this unprecedented breach of protocol," Gregory stammered, his face pale, bowing slightly. "The Wellington Club prides itself on absolute discretion. She will be escorted from the premises immediately. I assure you—" "Gregory," Gallagher interrupted, his tone remarkably gentle but laced with unyielding authority. "If you so much as raise your voice to Miss Hayes again, I will buy this club tomorrow morning and turn it into a parking lot for my freight trucks. Do we understand each other?" Gregory swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. Perfectly, sir." "Good. Leave us. Close the doors." The heavy oak doors clicked shut, plunging the room back into a profound, insulated quiet. Only 3 people remained: Gallagher, his exhausted young accountant, and Audrey. Audrey stood by the sideboard, the adrenaline finally crashing out of her system. Her hands began to shake. The reality of her insubordination was settling in. Yes, she had saved a pension fund, but she had also just incinerated her only source of income. The $4,000 a week in cash tips she relied on to pay for her father's specialized memory care facility was gone. Gallagher slowly walked over to the side table where Audrey had placed the bottle of Chateau Margaux. He picked it up, inspected the label, and then picked up 2 empty crystal glasses. He walked back to the main table, sat down heavily in his chair, and poured a generous measure into both glasses. He pushed one across the polished wood. "Sit down, Audrey," he said. Audrey hesitated. "Sir, I am not permitted to—" "You just cost a private equity titan $50 million and saved my company from being butchered," Gallagher said, a tired, genuine smile finally breaking across his weathered face. "I think we can suspend the club rules. Please. Sit." Audrey untied her starched white apron, folding it neatly, and laid it over the back of a chair before sitting down opposite the billionaire. "Why did you do it?" Gallagher asked, taking a slow sip of the wine. "You had nothing to gain. You had everything to lose. You could have stayed silent, collected your tip, and gone home. Why stick your neck out for a trucking company you have no stake in?" Audrey looked down at her hands, tracing the faint calluses on her palms. "My father's name is Thomas. He drove a rig for 25 years. 8 of those years were for a subsidiary of Meridian, out of the Newark depot." Gallagher's eyebrows rose in surprise. "He was one of my boys?" "Yes, sir," Audrey said softly. "He always said Meridian treated him square, but he transferred to a different logistics firm before he retired. 3 years ago, a private equity group bought that firm in a leveraged buyout. They used the exact same mezzanine debt trap that Covington just tried to use on you. They triggered a technical default, seized the pension trust to pay off their senior lenders, and bankrupted the company. My father lost his entire pension." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Gallagher set his glass down, his eyes locked on her with intense, unbroken focus. "A month later," Audrey continued, her voice remarkably steady despite the lump forming in her throat, "he was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. The medical bills wiped out what little savings he had left. I was a doctoral candidate at MIT. I had to leave my program to come back to New York and take care of him. I took this job because the tips are the only way I can afford his around-the-clock nurses." Gallagher leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. He looked at the glowing screen of the laptop, where the red cliff of the 74% default rate still glared ominously, and then looked back at Audrey. "So, you didn't just see a math error," Gallagher rumbled. "You saw a murder weapon." "I saw the exact weapon that ruined my family," Audrey corrected him, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce intelligence. "I couldn't stand here and watch him use it on 4,000 other families. Not when the math was flawed. The math is never supposed to lie." "No, it isn't," Gallagher agreed. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a sleek leather wallet, and extracted a heavy, embossed business card. He slid it across the mahogany table toward her. "I don't have a chief risk officer at Meridian Freight," Gallagher said casually, though his eyes were deadly serious. "Historically, I've relied on outside consultants, like that idiot from McKinsey who almost let me sign my company away tonight. I need someone in-house, someone who can look at a 300-page term sheet and see the traps before the ink is even dry. Someone who isn't intimidated by men in expensive suits." Audrey stared at the card. The gold foil lettering caught the low light of the dining room. "Mr. Gallagher, I don't have my doctorate. I've been pouring wine for 3 years. You dismantled a proprietary quant model in 60 seconds without a calculator," Gallagher countered smoothly. "I don't care if you have a degree in finger painting. I care about your mind. And more importantly, I care about your loyalty. You fought for my workers today without them even knowing your name." He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "I will match whatever you are going to make as a first-year quant on Wall Street. I will give you a corner office in our Manhattan headquarters. And I will personally ensure your father is transferred to the best neurological facility on the East Coast, fully covered by Meridian's premier health plan." Audrey's breath hitched. The walls of the Wellington Club, which had felt like a luxurious prison for the last 3 years, suddenly seemed to dissolve. "I need an answer, Miss Hayes," Gallagher said, a hint of a smile returning to his eyes. "Because if you turn me down, I'm going to be very nervous about running my own company tomorrow." Audrey picked up the business card. The embossed letters felt solid, real, and heavy with promise. She looked at Dominic Gallagher, no longer a ghost in the background, but an equal player at the table. "When do I start?" she asked. "Tomorrow at 8 in the morning," Gallagher said, raising his glass. "And Audrey? No aprons." 6 months later, the financial landscape of New York had shifted profoundly. The story of the Wellington Club waitress had become an urban legend on Wall Street. Nobody knew her exact identity, as the club strictly enforced its non-disclosure agreements regarding the identities of its guests, but the rumors were terrifyingly accurate. A private equity giant had been publicly castrated by a woman holding a bottle of wine. Covington Capital was bleeding out. Following the disastrous dinner, Richard Sterling had pooled his sovereign wealth fund's liquidity. Without that backing, 3 of Covington's pending acquisitions fell through. The SEC, catching wind of the suddenly abandoned deals, opened a quiet but incredibly thorough investigation into Silas Croft's accounting practices. Alistair Covington was fighting a war on 3 fronts, desperate for a win to save his crumbling empire. Audrey Hayes, meanwhile, was sitting in a sunlit corner office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Freight Tower. She wore a sharp, tailored navy suit, her hair pulled back into a sleek, professional clasp. Her desk was a command center of 4 high-definition monitors, all streaming real-time data, complex algorithmic models, and logistical tracking arrays. She had completely restructured Meridian's corporate defense, building what the board affectionately called the Hayes Protocol, a quantitative early warning system that identified hostile accumulations of their stock before the SEC filings were even mandated. More importantly, her father, Thomas, was thriving. He had been moved to a state-of-the-art facility in upstate New York, surrounded by gardens and attended by top-tier specialists. The crushing weight of the medical debt had vanished, replaced by the deep, quiet satisfaction of knowing she had saved him. But Audrey knew that predators like Alistair Covington didn't simply fade away. They grew desperate, and desperate men made reckless moves. The intercom on her desk buzzed. "Audrey, Dominic is on his way down to your office," her assistant said. A moment later, Gallagher strode in, looking more energetic and formidable than he had in years. "Show me what you found," he said, bypassing pleasantries and leaning over her desk to look at her central monitor. Audrey tapped her keyboard, bringing up a massive web of offshore holding companies and shell corporations. "Covington is making a final play," Audrey explained, her voice sharp and analytical. "He's heavily leveraged, practically running on fumes, but he's managed to secure a high-interest line of credit from a shadow bank in Geneva. He's not coming after us. He knows our defenses are too strong." "Then who is he hunting?" Gallagher asked, narrowing his eyes at the screen. "Coastal Logistics," Audrey pointed to a highlighted node on the graph. "They handle 60% of the last-mile delivery routes for the mid-Atlantic region. They've had a bad quarter due to fuel spikes, and their stock is depressed. Covington is quietly accumulating a controlling interest. He plans to execute a hostile takeover, strip their assets, and flip their contracts to a competitor to generate immediate cash flow to save his own fund." Gallagher scowled. "Coastal is one of our primary partners. If they go under, our supply chain in the mid-Atlantic gets bottlenecked. We'll lose millions in delivery guarantees." "Exactly," Audrey said, a cool, dangerous smile touching the corners of her mouth. "Covington isn't just trying to save himself. He's trying to indirectly hurt us in the process. It's vindictive." "Can we warn Coastal?" "They wouldn't be able to defend themselves in time. They don't have the capital," Audrey replied. She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers much in the same way Gallagher had done 6 months prior. "But we do." Gallagher looked at her, seeing the mathematical gears turning furiously behind her eyes. "What's the play, Audrey?" "Covington is using distressed debt to finance this acquisition," she explained, pulling up a new spreadsheet. The formulas were clean, elegant, and perfectly balanced. "He's buying up Coastal's short-term liabilities through a proxy, but because he's over-leveraged, his margin requirements with the Geneva Bank are incredibly fragile." She highlighted a single, pulsing cell on her screen. "I've mapped his entire risk profile. If the price of Coastal's stock suddenly spikes, Covington's short positions and derivative hedges will instantly become toxic. He'll face a margin call he can't cover. The Geneva Bank will seize his assets and liquidate his fund entirely." Gallagher's eyes widened as the sheer ruthlessness of her plan dawned on him. "You want me to buy Coastal Logistics?" "Not buy them outright. We don't want the regulatory headache," Audrey corrected. "I want you to announce a strategic partnership and a massive, exclusive 10-year freight contract with them. We infuse them with $100 million in preferred equity to modernize their fleet." "If we announce that," Gallagher whispered, staring at the numbers, "Coastal's stock price will double overnight." "It will triple," Audrey corrected precisely. "And Covington's position will instantly collapse. He's built a house of cards, Dominic. All we have to do is open a window." Gallagher stood in silence for a long time, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Manhattan skyline. He thought of the thousands of men and women who drove for Coastal, people just like Audrey's father, who were entirely unaware that a wolf was scratching at their door. And he thought of the quiet waitress who had saved him from the exact same fate. "Do it!" Gallagher ordered, a fierce grin breaking across his face. "Draft the press release. Call the board. Execute the equity purchase at market open tomorrow." "Understood," Audrey said, her fingers already flying across the keyboard, setting the traps, arming the algorithms. The next morning at 9:30 a.m., the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange rang. Simultaneously, Meridian Freight released its press statement regarding the massive strategic partnership with Coastal Logistics. The market reacted with violent enthusiasm. Coastal's stock, which had been languishing at $12 a share, rocketed to $38 within the first hour of trading. 10 blocks away, in the lavish, panic-stricken offices of Covington Capital, screens flashed neon red. Alistair Covington stood frozen, watching his margin requirements explode past his available liquidity. The Geneva Bank initiated an automated liquidation protocol. His phones began ringing incessantly, a chorus of furious investors demanding answers. He had been checkmated, again, and this time there was no way out. He had underestimated the logistics titan, but more fatally, he had forgotten the cardinal rule of mathematics. For every action, there is a rigorously calculated, devastating reaction. Audrey Hayes stood by the window of her corner office, sipping a cup of coffee. She watched the ticker tape on her secondary monitor scroll past, confirming the absolute destruction of Covington Capital's market position. She felt no malice, only the cold, satisfying equilibrium of a perfectly solved equation. The ghost of the Wellington Club had finally laid her demons to rest, proving that the greatest power in the room rarely wears the most expensive suit. It belongs to the one who truly understands the numbers. The story of Audrey Hayes proves that true power lies not in volume or pedigree, but in the quiet mastery of reality's underlying mechanics. By breaking her silence, she transcended the invisible role society assigned her, weaponizing her intellect to dismantle arrogance and protect thousands of vulnerable lives. Alistair Covington's downfall serves as a stark reminder that ego is a fragile liability when confronted by undeniable objective truth. Ultimately, Audrey didn't just correct a mathematical error. She corrected a moral imbalance, proving that the most formidable force in any room is the person who understands the numbers well enough to rewrite the rules. Her journey from the shadows of a dining room to the summit of corporate strategy is a testament to the unyielding power of analytical precision. Would you like me to elaborate on the specific financial mechanics of a leveraged buyout, or perhaps explore another story centered on an underdog outsmarting the elite?